Amen. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 13. Let's start with this verse here. Now, I was given a card, I guess it was last week, and I lost the card, but I got the question in my mind. I know what the question is. And the question goes like this. If a church grows beyond its facility, is it right for that church to go to having two separate services? Or what would be some options for that church if it outgrows its facility? Now we know 1 Corinthians 12 and verse 13 tells us that for by one Spirit we are all baptized into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, whether slaves or free, we have all been made to drink into one Spirit. So there is one church, there is one body, and in a local setting, you have normally a church that has a location, and sometimes this happens, they grow numerically to the point where the entire church cannot fit into that one location. And some churches have chosen to go to two services as a result of that. Would that be right?
In the discussions we've had in the past couple of weeks, I don't see a reason why a church couldn't have 17 services on a Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
If that church chose to have 17 services.
Okay. Anything else?
Wouldn't that be trying to meet the needs of the members by having more than one person? If the building isn't big enough?
That's a point, meeting the needs of the people. Because the concept there is you have one group of the congregation meet first, let's say at 9 o'clock. And then the second group that did not meet of the same congregation meet at 11 o'clock. That way, the big congregation could still be within that one location. It's almost as if you have shifts, so to speak. You're having one group worship first of the same church, and then another group come in later on of the same church to worship at that same location because their building is not big enough to hold all of the membership.
I've seen them where they swapped. Ones that were in a Bible class went to worship, and they did vice versa.
Yes, sir.
What I think you have to be careful of is not to separate the two from worship with one another. The church at Corinth had a problem in that they were segregating themselves, and as long as it's one body, and you don't have I'm a 9 o'clock member and you're a 12 o'clock member, and the 9 o'clock members don't fellowship with the 12 o'clock members, then I don't see a problem with having two separate worship assemblies.
Okay.
But part of fellowship is being able to encourage each other on personal levels. We already know each other and know each other's personal lives so that we can encourage one another and draw each other closer to God. And we can't, I couldn't see how we could do that even if, because I've been part of a congregation where they not only did I just go to a certain time, but I was almost required, like they separated us and said, you go to this one and you go to this one. It's just, I didn't choose. I mean, not that that's what we would do, but, I didn't know the other people on a personal level.
They actually assigned you a service.
Yeah.
I've never been in a congregation that does that, so I don't know how they operate.
Church of Christ.
Oh, okay. Well, churches of men, there's no telling what they do. One solution possibly could. Does anyone have anything else on this? One possible solution to this, let's say it's a building that can only hold 100 people. And they can only hold 100, but the church there has had growth. They have had success in spreading the gospel. They have grown to 200. Well, you can't get 200 people in a building that is for 100 because of the physical limitation and because of law. We're to abide by the law of the land when you can't have too many people in a building that it cannot hold because of fire codes and things such as that. One possible solution to a problem like that is to have that church divide into two congregations, to become two. If they had the money for that one congregation go to another part of town where the church is not found, or maybe even to an area right outside the town. It could be it's a big city or a bigger town, and you could have the north side Church of Christ, and then that congregation gets so big, you can have a south side congregation, a church planting, as it's sometimes referred to, in which you have that congregation, if they have the money to do that, divide in a biblical way, and faithful brethren go over here to the south side, and and they decide who gets the building and the facility there at the north side, and then you have in one city you have two faithful congregations that can reach probably more people than one congregation at one location. That's a possibility. I have known of congregations in which two different congregations occupy the same building, but not at the same time. I've known of congregations where you had an English-speaking church and a Spanish-speaking congregation, and they were two distinct, separate congregations, and they respected each other's independence and autonomy. The English met at one time, and then in the afternoon on that Sunday, the Spanish congregation met. And so they would not be meeting together because of the language barrier. And so you had one location with two congregations meeting there, and that can work. If the congregation, even if they all speak English, if the congregation in my scenario, you have 200 and 100 says we need to be a separate congregation because we cannot manage in this location to be 200. You could have two congregations occupying one building meeting at different times. That is a possible solution to that. The problem in our society is we have gotten caught up with the whole mega church concept. We think that a big church building and a big church is something that we should have. And so these churches get bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's like a status. It's almost like in the material world, people getting big houses. So look at this big house I've got here. It's a status in society. Well, this Church of Christ gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and then they build and they build a bigger building, which is nothing wrong with building bigger. But they go into it with a lot of money, and they've got to pay off the note on that building they've taken a loan out on, and they start wanting to compromise and soften the preaching because they've got to get people to give to pay off that note, and they're not going to be as hard on marriage, divorce, and remarriage, and they're not going to be as hard on other doctrines. In fact, they just might kind of gloss over them and not preach the whole counsel of God. And as a result, you've got a big group of people who are spiritually weak. And so I think that's a problem, and it's because so many brethren look to the denominational world and they say, oh, look at these big mega churches. Look at these big old churches. And they draw them in with all kind of entertainment, all kind of gimmicks. Come on in, and we will entertain you. We will please you. We will have a ministry just for you. And it's nothing more than almost a college type of attitude. They even call their facilities now a campus. not called a church building anymore, it's called a campus. And they have Professor so-and-so as the teachers. Sounds like a college type of mentality instead of a church being a church. Yes?
You just described Lake Point Church to a T, and they went down as far as even having a spiritual Saturday night service. You get that money to pay for that more.
Right. And then the strange thing is they want to break down into little cell groups, they call them. They want the big mega church, but then for fellowship reasons, they'll break the big mega church, they'll divide it up into cell groups. Well, you know, there's nothing wrong with a big congregation. In fact, the church began as what we would call a big congregation in Acts chapter 2. There were 3,000 there. But they had a complex that could support that. There was a huge temple complex there that was several acres. It covered several acres. And so you could that temple complex where the church met could accommodate that large a people. So the building was in place, so to speak, for them as the church began and they started making converts and people were being added to it. I think that when growth happens, and I know that this has happened in other places and in other times, that instead of getting too big for a church to manage, as we said before, not only for the purposes of fitting within a building, but an eldership trying to oversee a big congregation, the bigger it gets, the less they're able to shepherd in an effective way. You get a church 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 1,000, 2,000. How are a group of maybe 10, 20 elders supposed to shepherd a group that big? And I hate to say this, and I don't want to make it sound like a stereotype, because there are exceptions to this statement I'm going to make. It seems as though the bigger the church, the more liberal they are. The more they're willing to compromise. And the eldership is liberal and not willing to enforce church discipline. In these big churches of 5, 6, 7, 800, you can ask them, when was the last time you practiced church discipline? I can guarantee you, most of them haven't done it probably in many, many decades. Because if they do, they're going to make some people mad, and their big congregation will shrink a little bit. Then you start teaching the truth on marriage, divorce, and remarriage, then that congregation is going to shrink a little bit more. Do you know that a congregation sometimes has to shrink numerically to get stronger spiritually? That has to happen sometimes. It has to shrink numerically sometimes, not always, to get stronger spiritually. And bigger is not better. And brethren, think that look at that big church building. Look, they're so big that they got to have two services. Well, that's not good. That's not always a good thing. As the world sees it, that's success. But again, we've got to look at things the way God sees it. We've got to evaluate things the way God evaluates them according to the Scripture. And one of the things that happens in some of these services, they'll have two different types of services. They'll have a traditional service for people like us who want to remain faithful to the New Testament and just sing. Then they'll have a contemporary service for the happy clappies. They're the ones that want to clap during the worship. They're the ones that want the band. They want the song leaders as far as the praise team. That's the word I'm looking for. They want the praise team up there with the men and women with the mics and just leading, and they're clapping, and they're just this far from being Pentecostal. But that's what they want. So they'll have the services for the old fogies, like us, the traditionalists, they'll call us, and then the contemporary, the hip, the young people. Got to please those young people. It's very interesting. I was reading history, restoration history, not long ago. And you know how in the 1800s, how the the church in the early part, before 1850, pretty much the church was growing like wildfire throughout the United States. And in about mid-1840s, there was one church, I think it was Pendleton, might be the name of the place, I'm not sure. I think it was in Tennessee, where they wanted to please the young people, so they brought in an instrument for the young people to make them happy in their Bible classes. That instrument in the Bible class drifted into the auditorium. Then in 1849, you had the first record of a New Testament church on American soil using instrumental music. It resulted in division that we saw in 1906 with the census recognizing that the Christian church now is a separate body than the churches of Christ. Why? Because some brethren wanted to please some young people. So we got to be loyal to the Lord and be willing to please Him and teach the young people, this is how you please Him. This is how you worship Him. And having a church that's too big for its facility can have, it's a good problem to have if it's biblical scriptural growth. I mean, that's a good problem to have. I mean, I wish someday we would have that problem. And if we keep spreading the gospel, I hope that we will. But we will, we have to look at it and try to do it according to scriptural means and not try to accommodate people and divide the one body. Anything else on this?
When you point about the elders, thinking it would be unscriptural. If the eldership cannot shepherd the flock, would you agree with that?
Right. Right.
So, as an example, if I were in an eldership position, and there were two services with a large body, both services, I don't see how I could fulfill that leadership role in understanding who is at what service, whether you're still holding accountable, and understand what's going on, and keep a pulse on one body or the other, because I would be worshiping most likely at one or the other in both services. And maybe that's the solution as an eldership, and you're supposed to be a part of both services, so you stay in tune with the full body that needs together.
That's a very good point. How can you oversee and have your responsibilities as a shepherd when you have two services and you're just at one? I mean,
You almost would have to have two separate elderships, almost, because of that problem, is that you wouldn't be able to shepherd the flock correctly and only be at one service.
that's a good point, and that goes back to the concept of being two churches in one location. That way you have an eldership for A congregation and B congregation that meets at different times upon the first day of the week. And that way there's two congregations under the accountability of two different elderships.
But then the problem with that then is now you break the autonomous rule of having two separate elderships under one rule. Whenever they're under one congregational rule, I guess, so to speak.
Well, if you had two separate congregations, if they were meeting in the same place at different times, you would have two different churches. It'd be the same as having this church over here meet at 9 o'clock and this church over here at a different location meet at 2 o'clock, but they're just meeting in the same building. So you'd have an eldership that's over those congregations.
It could be done, but it would be a very difficult task to keep done correctly.
Right. Go ahead. Right. Yeah. Exactly. And a lot of times it's not even for the purpose of you're too big for it. Because if they have like a special service, they'll combine both services, and somehow they'll get everybody in the building, or everybody that wants to be there in the building. And the problem with the big churches, and again, please understand, there are exceptions to this statement, but very few. A lot of members like those big congregations because they can go and come as they please. There's no accountability. They're not missed when they're not there. They don't have anyone saying, we missed you for the past 3 months. But they don't even know. They don't even know who they are. That way they can slip in and slip out and slip in. You know there have been people here that have placed their membership here and then later on removed their membership. You know why? Because we asked, we missed you. And they don't like that. They don't like being held accountable for not attending service. And we're not talking about for sickness or for something beyond their control. We're talking about just spiritual laziness. And, you know, we've had people that place membership here, and they're here Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. And they're here, it's wonderful, wonderful preaching, wonderful church. Then they start missing on Wednesday night. Then they're just there Sunday morning, Sunday night. Then they stop, they taper off on Sunday night. Not there anymore on Sunday night. And then they're just there on Sunday. Then just every other Sunday. And then poof, they're gone. And they wanted everyone to know when they placed membership, but when they wanted to go to another church, it's a secret. Don't tell anybody. Well, you wanted everyone to know when you placed membership here, and now when you want to go to another congregation, I mean, we got to know who our membership is. See, it's accountability. We're all accountable to one another. We're one body. And so those big churches, they have a lot of disadvantages. And sad to say, a lot of time, a lot of compromising goes into growing them that big. That's how you grow a church really big. You start compromising the truth. Now, there are exceptions to that, I know. And I know in places in the world, the church is growing rapidly, numerically, daily. India, Africa, I get reports from them. I know what's going on. But here, the climate is just different now. It's not like it was years ago. We're in a different climate. Next question. Let's go on to 1 John chapter 4 and verse 1. Here is the question. When visiting a church for the first time, what are some ways to find out if the church is sound or not? 1 John 4 and verse 1. Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits whether they are of God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. So in visiting a church, let's say you move into a community, you're new, you're looking for a faithful church to be a part of, or perhaps you're on vacation and you're looking for, it's Sunday, you want to worship with the brethren. What are some ways to find out whether the church that you are visiting is sound? That's a good one. Ask. But more specifically. Because if you ask if you're sound, they'd say yes. There you go. That's getting more specific. Bulletin board, pamphlets. Right. Listen to what's being preached, you know, and hear that. You know, if you're visiting for the first time, you're looking for a new congregation, you need to spend at least 2 or 3 months before you make a decision. And you need to ask questions. I would suggest at least 2 months visiting that congregation and asking questions. And like you said, we got to ask specific questions. Like, what do you teach on marriage, divorce, and remarriage? Is instrumental music sinful in worship? There are so many brethren that would not even want to touch that question anymore. They're so afraid to offend anybody, they won't even answer that anymore. So there's various types of questions that can be asked if you have a chance to ask them. I mean, one good thing to do is just sit down and make a list of questions. I have a list of about close to 100 questions that I have filled out before at a congregation that did not know me, and they wanted me to come and preach for them, and they were going to support me in doing some mission work. And I knew some of the members. They knew me ever since I was a teenager. And one of those men that knew me ever since I was a teenager, he said, Shawn, this is what they want. They want you to fill out this questionnaire about what you believe and teach. I said, I'm happy to do it. I'm glad you're asking me to do that. I respect you for asking me to do that. Because that's the only way you're going to know, is ask questions. So I filled out this long questionnaire, and we were in complete agreement on those issues. And it had various topics on there. That's one way of doing it. Walking in the door and looking at the track rack, looking at their pamphlets. What are they putting forth? If they have tracts, if they have booklets. Do you recognize any of the authors, any of the subjects? Perhaps you even recognize the tracts or booklets themselves. Look at what the articles may be in the bulletin. That's one way of indicating. Of course, it could take some time to try to figure something out. If you're staying at a location for an X amount of time, because you need to learn that congregation. You need to figure them out. And if you're on vacation, there's some quick things you could look for. I mean, one of the first things I look at when I'm visiting a place I've never been before, I looked at their track rack. I look at what they're advertising. I look at their bulletin. And I try not to make a knee-jerk reaction as well. I believe in Ronald Reagan's statement, trust but verify. That was his philosophy about the communist. Trust but verify. So I trust that these are brethren. And I'm going to verify that by putting them to the test. 1 John 4 and verse 1. And so there was one time I was very completely thrown off and completely fooled. It was a learning experience. We were coming back from Yellowstone. It was in Wyoming, one of the congregations there. We found them on a Wednesday night. Me and my wife and and her parents, the in-laws, we went in there. We looked at the track rack. It had some good stuff there. I mean, good material. Some of the publications they had on the table, again, very good material. Talked to the preacher, and he was from Texas. So I said, well, that's a plus, And so we sat down in the class, and long story short, it was the most liberal garbage you could ever imagine. And it blew me away, because I did not even, from the appearance of what I saw in the track rack and on the table, it looked to me to be a sound congregation. I recognize these names. I recognize these tracts. These topics are sound. These are good things. And he had some of the most ridiculous concepts that you could ever imagine.
Did you go back to the back and bring a tract to the...
No, I kept interrupting his class because he kept saying things that were just flat out wrong. So I left. I left his class in the middle of class. My in-laws stayed in there, and they continued to spar with him. But I knew that if I stayed in there, I was going to be interrupting his class more and more, because they were studying out of a denominational book, and they were bringing up all these kind of denominational concepts, and I just can't stay still for that. So I had to leave, and the in-laws, they finished out and kind of battled with him. Yes, Leonard. That is actually a very good way of determining a person's mindset. Ask them if they know Johnny Ramsey, or if they know some of the sound brethren that we are familiar with, and what they think of them. There are some brethren not far from here in Union Valley. They, when I first met them and was getting to know them, they would badmouth people like Thomas Warren, Marvin Weir, and others who were sound preachers of the gospel. And those were red flags that came up immediately. When you start talking bad about sound brethren and calling them names like legalists and Pharisees, then that says a lot about you. Now, those are red flags. There are several red flags. I mean, some of the more obvious ones that we're probably going to see more and more. Unfortunately, as time goes on, you walk in there and you hear instrumental music. That's going to be an immediate red flag that I cannot worship in spirit and in truth here because they're not doing it. Or a woman gets up to teach or preach. Did you?
That's always my biggest fear when I'm on vacation. We're going to walk in the church we know nothing about, and there's going to be a piano there or something.
Exactly.
Playing in the background where you can't see it.
Right.
Anyway, the tracks are a real good hint. We found the tracks. If they're real sound, good tracks, it's pretty good.
It is, except that one exception that I went to, and that blew my mind. Yeah, I felt really good sitting down there, and I said, oh, this is going to be good, and boy, was I wrong. I forgot. I'll have to get back with you on that. Now, they're sparse. But there's going to be the problem of females getting up and teaching. In fact, about 14, 15 years ago, I went to visit a Church of Christ in Arlington. I'd heard that they were on a liberal side, and I like to check out for myself. I don't like to just take hearsay. I want to go find out for myself. Well, I went up into one of their Bible classes and sitting there waiting for the teacher, and I was in the college age bracket at that time. Anyway, this girl starts teaching the class. And I was like, whoa. You're going to teach the class? He said, yeah, the elders let women teach the class. Well, I brought up a few scriptures in objection to that, and I said, I can't sit here and do this. And so I got up and I walked out. And the preacher saw me on the way out, and he said, did you find the class? Because I'd asked him before. I said, yes, I did. He said, do you know a woman's up there teaching a mixed gender class? Oh, yeah. He was just fine with it. And we were supposed to meet together and study that issue, and he never called me. He never returned my call, and we never got together and had a study on that. But again, that's going to be something we're going to face because as churches of Christ, a lot of preachers are being educated at ACU, and they're being sent north. They're being sent up north to Wyoming, to Montana, to the northern states, to these churches that were at one time sound, but now these change agent preachers are going up there and taking them over. And so that's something that we're going to find. But we have to put everybody to the test. As John says here in 1 John 3 and verse 4, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirit whether they be of God, because many false prophets have gone out in the world. And the world's population is a lot bigger now than it was then. So that word many has a bigger significance now than it did back then when he wrote that. There are many false teachers out into the world. So it's not a 100% guarantee if it says Church of Christ on the building that you're going to find faithful brethren. I mean, it used to be that way to a greater extent years ago, but not so much anymore. Oh, that's a good one.
Very long to discover, just looking at their bulletin, the schedule of services, who's teaching the classes, or just their website and some of the groups they have and what they're involved in. It's really eye-opening.
I'm glad you brought that up because that's one of the things I wanted to bring up. Go to their website. Look at who they're linked to. look at their link page, and if they're linked to denominational organizations or they're linked to very liberal universities, plus you can just read in some of the things that they say concerning their belief system, you can detect things. And sometimes it's very subtle. You gotta look at what they're saying and kind of read it and understand what's being said there. In fact, you could even you would have on their contact information like a phone number or perhaps an email, which you could email the preacher and talk to them about certain things. And yeah, that's a very good point. The website is a very telling mechanism that would keep you from finding a church that's contrary to the will of God or finding one that is in harmony with God's will. Do you know that our website that we've had has had two purposes? Number one, it attracts sound brethren. Number two, it repels liberal brethren. Because liberal-minded brethren get on our website and they see what we stand for and they want a congregation that's a little bit looser than us. But sound-minded brethren see our website, see what we stand for. I've had them call me and ask me and talk to me a little bit further, and it was the website that caught their eye and said, this is what I'm looking for. You're a sound congregation. Yes, sir?
There used to be a published directory of churches of Christ.
Right. We got one right there on the...
Yeah.
Yes, and it usually lists all of them. It's just a kind of a broad brush listing of all of them. I want to try to get this last question in because we still have some time, and I don't want to quit right now. It's concerning the death penalty. Here's the question: how can Christians be pro-life and for the death penalty at the same time?
I think one of the, for me, whenever I even have to consider this topic, one of the main passages that I look to is in Romans, in chapter 12 or 13.
13.
About government.
13. Mm-hmm.
And how the government has its particular role of executing justice. There's also the passage in 1 or 2 Peter, that says that the government's not an avenger of those that are good, but those that are evil. They work on, don't want to say on God's behalf. It's, forget the wording. But the fact is that government is there to execute the judgment and is a neutral party in most cases, so that there's no vigilante justice
Right.
that goes around.
Right.
Because human beings aren't perfect. I'm sure mistakes have been made in the past, but this is the way that God has set things up based on His Word for government to take that role and execute justice that way.
That's a good point. If we had more time, we would get into Romans 13 that does talk about that. We might have to extend this into next week to talk about it further. One thing that has to be, and I want to go ahead and get into this a little bit deeper, one thing that has to be established in talking about this, and this question is going to come up in conversations, especially with coworkers and classmates, and as more and more states in our union drop the death penalty, more and more of them are giving him up. Now, Texas leads the nation in executing criminals. I don't know if that's a thing we should be, kind of. I think it's good in a sense, but it's one of those things that we do. I mean, it's the reality. Texas leads the nation. Other states are dropping it all together. And so the question is going to come up, if you're a Christian and you're for the death penalty, how can you be pro-life? How can you say you're pro-life? The short answer to that is we would be for the death penalty for those who have done things worthy of death. The unborn are innocent. They're human beings. You don't get any more innocent than the unborn. They haven't done anything to deserve death. And the second thing that has to be established is who invented the death penalty? It was God. God is the one who established the death penalty. In Genesis chapter 4, verses 13 through 15, we don't have time to look in that, but when Cain killed Abel, Cain realized that he was under judgment, and he says, whoever finds me will kill me. So there was a sense in which Cain recognized he shed his brother's blood. His life needs to be taken. Now, I do know when we get to Genesis chapter 9, after the flood, we see it clearly set forth, this death penalty. Genesis chapter 9, verses 5 through 6. Surely for your lifeblood I will demand a reckoning. For the hand of every beast I will require it, and from the hand of man. From the hand of every man's brother I will require the life of a man. Look at verse 6. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made man. So here you have God speaking, and he says, if you shed man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. In other words, I'm authorizing a system by which if someone takes someone else's life, and there is a difference between killing and murder. In the Hebrew words for murder and kill are two different Hebrew words. And the teaching in the Hebrew in the Old Testament is you shall not murder. But it does authorize the government to kill. There is an authorizing of a government to execute. And here you have it here in Genesis chapter 9. When you get to Exodus chapter 21, verses 12, 15 through 17, you find some of the crimes that are punishable by the death penalty. Striking your parents. Striking someone so that they die. Also, throughout the law of Moses, you find other crimes. Homosexuality was punished by the death penalty. And did you know in the 13 original colonies of our nation that homosexuality was punished by the death penalty? That's what our founding fathers thought of homosexuality. They would roll over in their graves if they knew what our nation was doing today. So God says, if you're not going to repent, you should die. That's what God says about it. And rape and kidnapping, there are 16 crimes altogether in the law of Moses that said this deserves the death penalty. Breaking the Sabbath, things of that nature.
But who was the judge of that? God was the judge of that. Man
Right.
was not.
Right.
So, and one of the things God hates is one who sheds innocent blood.
Right. Right.
And we've got to be very careful that we're not the person that sheds the innocent blood.
Right. The innocent blood.
Where does it say an eye for an eye?
Well, that's in the law of Moses, and that was dealing with, again, a court procedure retribution, not just vigilante. Well, you poked my eye out, I'm going to get you. It's not talking about that. It's saying if you've been found guilty of hurting someone and you put their eye out, then through a punishment procedure, your eye is going to be put out. And so that's what you find in the law of Moses. And in Romans chapter 13, as Aaron pointed out, it talks about the government and how we're to obey the government. Verse 4, for he is God's minister, and this is talking about the government officials, to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister to an avenger, to execute wrath on him who practices evil. So this authorizes government officials to bear arms and to kill. This authorizes, to put it in a practical sense, the policemen of Royse City to have weapons. And if need be, pull that weapon on someone. And if need be, shoot that person dead. Now that's not what we want, but sometimes it has to get to that. And God has authorized them to have that authority. They're God's ministers to you for good, the government official. So the death penalty is authorized by God. He's the one who invented it. Very quickly, we won't look at this, but Acts chapter 25 verse 11, Paul said, if I've done anything worthy of death, I do not refuse to die, when he was standing before officials. And then in Proverbs 6 verse 16 through 19, it's the shedding of innocent blood that's the problem. And that's exactly what the pro-life position is saying. We should not shed innocent blood. And that which is in the womb is innocent. But those who are guilty of things worthy of death, according to the Bible, they should die. We'll take up our study next week.